Hello, I'm glad to be back and here joined with Mark Carney. He doesn't need much introduction, but I'll remind people he was the head of two different central banks, Canada and the United Kingdom. That's a huge job right there. Also head of the Financial Stability Board. And for those involved in climate, he needs no introduction. He's been hugely involved for years in this issue of how do we get enough financing to actually have an impact on climate change. So Mark, thank you for being here. And I'm interested in that question. Where do you think we are currently on the idea of the amounts of money needed and how we connect them to projects? I have ideas, but I really want to hear how you're thinking about that challenge.
Absolutely, and thank you, David, for having me. I know you're incredibly busy working on these and many other issues. The first thing to say is scale of the problem, or scale of the issue, which is we need to effectively double spending investment on energy infrastructure for decades. So we're talking an extra two and a half trillion dollars of investment in energy infrastructure alone. And that's before the spending on resilience, adaptation, hard to abate sectors, other aspects. And about three quarters of that spend will be in emerging and developing economies, as you know well. So these are big, big numbers, approaching 2% of global GDP. Where's the money going to come from? As you know, the bulk from the private sector. And let me just give you one figure and then hand back, which is what we've been working on is getting the best of the private sector committed to net zero transition. Big banks, insurers, asset managers, asset owners. The number as we speak today is $90 trillion of balance sheet committed for that. And that's not for some distant date. It's near-term 5-year commitments, fair share of the 50% reduction by 2030. So now the challenge is how do we marry that capital, that commitment with where it's needed most, channel it to those emerging and developing economies.
I just spoke with President Ivan Duque of the president of Colombia, and Colombia has an NDC that's interesting. It's to reduce by 50% from the baseline. So the baseline is for growth in greenhouse gas emissions, and it's going to be reduced by 50% by 2030. So it's a tall order. So I asked him, how do you finance that? And it means a lot of projects. So identifying the major emitters within Colombia, some of which are land use, for example, in addition to fossil fuels. How do you reduce that? And you can finance it somewhat by securitizing assets as they come available, by creating ways to subsidize or to add grant money, foundation money, for example, to a given project, working maybe with the World Bank or with the Inter-American Development Bank on a way to do a project. So it brings together all the sources of financing with the projects that are to be done. Can we discuss various new techniques that can be done through with you have huge expertise in that.
Well, I think the thing, and it's very exciting what President Duque and Colombia are doing, and I think this goes directly to where we can move the system. And as you well know, the World Bank has been developing and working hard on country platform approaches, and I think the opportunity is to extend them and blend in that very large scale of money I was just talking about, the 90 trillion from GFANZ. And what we need to have at the heart of it are two things, I think. One is the appropriate blended finance vehicles at scale. So think of the IFC's MCPP, is one great example of that. There are other examples. Those appropriate approaches. The right private sector forms of financing. CFLI is an example, fast infrastructure, a new example. These are proven methods that the private sectors come together for the format for project investing. But as well, I think with the imprimatur, if I may, of the World Bank and others to say that a program such as Colombia's is consistent with the transition the world needs, that unlocks an opportunity for the private sector, which is looking for exactly that type of net zero alignment, but really isn't on its own able to make those determinations independently, or else it's subject to greenwash and other concerns. So bringing all those elements, the best of blended finance of the World Bank and other MDBs, the best of private sector platform approaches, CFLI, Fast Infra as two examples. There are a few more that GFANZ has identified. but also connecting them with pure private finance that's consistent with the transition, such as the one you just discussed in Colombia.
We're working with South Africa on this, and we have a pilot project. I've proposed kind of a concept structure where there's sources of financing that include foundations, and it also includes the desire by the private sector to buy carbon credits. So then that cash flow comes into projects that will actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You also need the South African government, and you can have the World Bank working with the government on that structure, and then also IFC or other entities that are private sector oriented to try to add renewables as South Africa decommissions coal plants. So that's a practical way to bring together these large, important individual sources of funding into one spot. And I think we need to have a lot of demonstration projects and 1,000 projects like that to get traction.
I think let me make 2 points on the South African one, which is incredibly important. One is, first, you mentioned carbon credits or carbon offsets and the ability for that be part. That is absolutely part of the solution. And of course, one of the things we've been doing for COP is to put in place a blueprint for that market, the infrastructure for that market. 400 different organizations worked on it. It's there. The new governance structure is there. This is potentially $100 billion a year flow from companies in advanced economies to projects such as in South Africa and elsewhere in the emerging and developing world. So it's incredibly exciting and important. And then the second point, which is critical, is there are assets such as coal and coal generation in South Africa that need to be defeased, need to be wound down in a just transition. Of course, we have to ramp up other things at the same time. And we need responsible owners of those assets. And again, it needs to be as part of an integrated strategy. So again, we see that as part of I'll call it a country platform approach. It can be called different things, but that integrated approach, which almost by definition has the World Bank at its core, because it's not just unique expertise, but can bring together the elements that in some cases take off some of the risks, but in other cases just integrate pure private flows with multilateral and blended flows.
That's a great description. And one of the things we've struggled with or we're aware of is that this just transition takes many years. It may take decades. Even in Poland, where we've worked in moving households away from coal, it takes a long time to then have that penetrate to the mining of coal, the workers that are working in that, and how do you get the transition going? So one thing that the World Bank can bring to this effort is longevity, is the idea that you're going to work for years in order to prove a project is actually decommissioning coal and moving workers away from coal mining and from coal generation.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Mark, a question: Is there one area of finance where you think there needs to be the biggest advance? I've mentioned carbon credits. That may be one, or offsets. Where do you think the hardest part is right now?
Well, look, I think, David, I will underscore the carbon off. Getting that market off and running is critically important. And let me underscore a couple reasons why. One is these natural climate solutions that are at the heart of carbon credits. I mean, this is going to help us with biodiversity. But very importantly, speaking of just transitions, this brings jobs and growth to the regions, very much, in many cases, very helpful for indigenous peoples in these economies. So a lot of co-benefits that come with the decarbonization. I think the other thing, David, is that the types of structures you're talking about that where there is some element of first loss that's taken. It could be by foundations, it could be by some other multilateral structure, but really developing them in a way that can be scaled rapidly. Last point, again, I'll just reemphasize that integrated country platform approach does, for major emerging markets, certainly unlock private finance that doesn't necessarily require that blending, because after all, we've got 90 trillion of assets looking for net zero aligned opportunities. And the approach that we're talking about can point the way to them.
Thanks. That's a great close. I want to thank Mark Carney for all the engagement here today. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, David, and thanks for everything you're doing.